Wow. Hello everybody. Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Ben Treat, and maybe you've seen some of my work. I do stop motion animation, and I've been doing it for many a year now. I feel old. I've recently just made a stop motion using chess. Wow, and you guys seem to really like it. So I wanted to do a breakdown and a frame by frame of what I made. If you haven't seen it already, here it is. Before I started on this project, I had a couple ideas for how I wanted to see it go. I really wanted to bring to life my childhood idea of what a chess match should be like. I've always imagined chess pieces fighting each other with a lot of personality. Like a horse, it moves in a very weird way. And I really wanted to illustrate that through claymation and stop motion. But going into this animation, I decided it would be better to lean into almost like a more naturalistic way of animating these pieces. I wanted them to stretch and squash and splatter, and instead of using actual swords that would be animated in their hands, I would use body movement, body language, and I would have big movements like this, and then the action would take place as if a sword was swung, when really it's just the motion that leads the viewer to understand kind of the intent of the chess piece. And as you just saw, and hopefully you'll agree, I think it came out pretty good. I'm pretty happy with it. So let me go through frame by frame and kind of break down a couple of the shots I made and why I did what I did for what purpose. Even though everybody knows chess and they can probably guess what's going to happen, I decided I needed an establishing shot. Mostly to procure the vibe of the video and the aesthetic that I'm going to keep throughout the whole piece. I leaned pretty heavy on what I would call like a dark academia, old English feel. And I achieved that using old books, silver coins, an old bank teller's light. I think the aesthetic really pulls together kind of the ambiance of this video, which I think kind of was some meat to this content. For the opening scene, I really wanted to show the passage of time. I wanted to show what it feels like to sit through a chess game and just time whirling by. But I really didn't want to see the players themselves. I decided that having hands like time-lapsed in and flying in and out would kind of destroy the magic of the stop motion of it. But I really wanted to make it feel like a time lapse as well. So I added things like an analog clock, candles burning down, and then I set the whole thing up on a camera slider to kind of give a depth of the space. One little Easter egg about this shot is the chess game being played in the time lapse is actually a very famous chess game from 1999 between Kasparov and Topalov, which I had to look up. I went on Google and I just searched most famous chess game, and that is what came up. So I went with it. And besides the fact that I definitely could never move pieces as smartly as they could, I figured I might as well imitate a famous chess game in the process. Just in case there's an uber chess nerd that could pick up on it. I don't think anybody did, but I think it's really fun to throw in stuff like that. It kind of adds, I think, more heart to the content. I like the Easter eggs in content, so I just am gonna broadly assume that other people do as well, even if they never noticed. My feet are falling asleep. Oh no. Okay, scene 2. We had a wide shot, we established it. Now, I wanna get intimate into the game. I wanna follow a chess piece in its individual move. So I decided to choose the horse, which I'm calling it a horse because I hate knight. I think it should be called a horse because it looks like a horse and you can't tell me that's not a horse. And I don't care because I will not get knight right. I'll call it a rook and then I'm gonna cry. I follow the knight. Ugh, I follow the horse as it does one of its dumb little weird L shapes. And I decide that it needs to get sniped by a bishop. You're always playing your horse and you always get sniped by a bishop. I wanted you to feel that the bishop takes out that horse. I really didn't waste any time. I went straight into the impact. I used one frame with a smear frame. I really sculpted quite the splatter and the of the horse melting away. So something fun that I did is I actually took the candle getting snuffed and I added that in after the fact. While watching the footage, I decided that it would be fun if the candle snuffed at the same time that the horse got snuffed. So instead of animating a whole new cotton, fluffy smoke animation. I ended up taking the same smoke effect that I animated in this animation, and I brought over the green screen element and keyed it and matched the lighting, and it saved me a little bit of time. I kind of doubt anybody would be able to notice, and so far nobody's noticed. I've used that smoke animation like a couple times. This is the meat of what I wanted to animate. This is what I, as a child, would envision on the chessboard because I had no screens. For this scene number 3, I wanted to keep my dynamic camera movement alive, and I wanted a really shallow depth of field because I want the viewer to remember that this is a tiny little chess game. It's its own tiny little world. And I know that we just came from a POV shot, which makes all the chess pieces feel big and life-size, but this is all happening in a tiny little island of action. I wanted the heart of the chess game to have a lot of like fighting, stabbing, slashing, and it's like when everything is set up and someone just pulls the trigger. I decided to pick up right where we left off, and I had the bishop snipe the horse that we just saw, but I changed how I animated it. I wanted the bishop to move kind of like Zenitsu with this anticipation and this massive smear, which, by the way, I used a pawn in this frame to add just a little after image smear, which I thought was really fun. It's just a little element for me because no one will ever see that, but it doesn't matter. I really like when you can use analog smear frames. And then I used cotton because cotton is kind of like a very fluffy, flowy material that does a really good smoke in stop motion. When you have a really fast motion like that and you use smear frames, it's nice to have something that counteracts that big motion kind of in the opposite direction. That's kind of like an ease out of that action in order for the viewer to really understand the pacing of it. So the smoke really lets that impact hit really hard. And I changed up how the horse gets splattered. All of the horse's splatter lands right in the pawn's face, which I thought was a really nice insult to injury to the pawn, just so that the pawn would get angry and step forward and slash at the bishop that just took out his friend, the horse. Now, to do all this, I actually had to sculpt the pawn and the bishop out of clay, because for the pawn's lurch forward, I didn't have any way to actually have arms, so I really had to rely on the body movement of the pawn, kind of going like this, whoosh, and then the after action of the bishop getting sliced so that it sells that kind of a knife slice. I sculpted the pawn so that I could bend him in a couple frames, and then I actually would blowtorch the clay so that it was shiny like these chess pieces. I'm not meant to be cross-legged. I'm not a cross-legged person. You cross-legged people are crazy. My feet are going so numb. The slash that you see happen when the pawn lurches forward is all analog. None of that is actually edited in. I took an index card, a white index card, and I cut little tiny slivers of paper and sticky tacked them onto the bishop. I think there's 5 frames of paper that slice right through the bishop, and that's when I switched to a clay bishop and have wire holding its head as it falls and splatters, and then the pawn lurching forward and knocking the body of the bishop, which also splatters. I think it's like maybe one of my favorite moments. And then, of course, since no piece is safe in chess, I had the black horse decide to snuff the life of the white pawn. I think at this point in the scene, there'd been enough sliding around on the board, so I wanted the horse to launch into the air. I decided to have him spin just so that it could kind of settle in the air so that the viewer could understand what was happening and land straight down onto the pawn, popping it like a pimple. Now for the horse's lunge, I actually ended up using clay smoke, mostly because I could hide wire through the center of the clay and I kind of could hold better form. I think I've decided I prefer the look of a crispy clay stop motion smoke to a fluffy cotton stop motion smoke. Cotton's just a little too unpredictable and clay just is crispier and has better control. Having that horse land down onto the pawn is just such a crispy like mwah, which I really thought was necessary. Very satisfying pop. I decided to end the scene there, and then the next scene kind of jumps forward in the game. There's a lot of game that happens between this middle of the game scene and the next scene that you see, which is endgame. I knew I needed to end the chess stop motion with a checkmate. So I wanted to set up kind of a hero's journey of a little pawn beating a big king. And one of the scenes that I knew I wanted from the very beginning was I wanted to see a pawn get to the end of the board and morph and like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde all the way into a queen. It's like a metaphor for life. I needed it to exist in my animation. So I set this scene up having the king down at the end of the board and the pawn being incredibly intimidated by this big hunkin' king. So to do that, I used a probe lens and I shot up through the board, manually sliding the camera up, and I got this POV shot of the king cowering down and looking down onto this pawn. I wanted the pawn to feel very small. And the fisheye end of this probe lens really lets you get such a crazy POV that you can't achieve kind of any other way. And it's just to really impact in that the pawn stands no chance. But I needed it to flip. It's kind of like the resolution, where all of a sudden the rook slides to defend the pawn's honor. Now this was a nice smear frame where I just took two castles and I sculpted clay in between them, and it just kind of like overshoots the end frame of where the castle's gonna land, which creates such a nice little bounce back. And it's just like a really nice, it's very crispy. Really happy with that movement. Once again, I used clay smoke to kind of do a little lead out of that movement. I did a little pre-shoot to make sure that this checkmate was gonna set up correctly before I animated it. And I actually did a little frame by frame. And for some reason, watching this sequence, I thought, yeah, this is checkmate. There's nowhere the king can go. But there's totally somewhere the king can go. So what I ended up having to do after the fact was I actually had to Photoshop a pawn in that blocks the one spot the king can go to make sure that it is actually a checkmate. And now everybody also commented, in this moment when we have a king, a pawn, and a castle, the king should not have moved away. It should have gotten in front of the pawn. So that was the blunder. That was that the king made. My legs. Now that I have the pawn finally make it to the end and do a little transition into a queen, just quickly, I also used a bishop as a little in-between, because a queen and a bishop and a pawn kind of feel like natural in-betweens for each other as it grows and becomes its fuller self. As I was planning for the next shot, I wanted to follow the pawn as like a POV as it becomes a queen and it morphs and it transitions. I actually didn't even think about how my previous shot has my king running away and jumping right in front of where the camera is going to be sliding. And I didn't realize that until I was actually animating it. Somehow stuff like this goes over my head. But I decided that it would be better if I actually had my camera go through my king, which ended up being something that people actually really liked. How I actually ended up doing it is I just moved my camera slowly in until it was completely blocked by the king's body. And then I took two queens and I set them next to each other. And I just used the little gap that's created in between the two queens and kind of aimed my camera to slide through it, and I just animated them going around it. So it looks like it goes through the king, but really the king just becomes two queens and slide around the camera. I thought that was really fun. And then I animated what I would call a pretty phallic transformation. I kind of was expecting people to comment on it, but no one really did. But I swear, I didn't even really think about it, but this looks like a penis. Tell me that doesn't look like a penis. It's just me in a basement sculpting penises. I swear my job is weird. But the pawn finally becomes a queen, and it can play out the checkmate that's been set up for it. To really rub it in. Just how it feels when you lose a game of chess, where your opponent just slides their piece and says, checkmate. I wanted that to come through with how the castle moves in this last moment. So I had him very slowly slide right into checkmate. So I had the idea to use a film technique to communicate that the king was now in checkmate. I wanted it to be like a sudden realization where the king realizes it's made mistakes and it's not coming back from them. So I used a dolly zoom, which is a filmmaking technique where essentially you slide your camera towards your subject while pulling your focus backwards so that your background kind of widens out away from your subject. It's a very cool effect. It's used in a lot of film. And I think it turned out pretty well. It's like a moment of realization where the king is dead. And I think it spills really nicely into an end scene, which I ended up deciding would be a simple beheading. Like, think about rulers of our actual world and how they tend to go. It's always beheadings. So instead of it being super dramatic, like all these other pieces getting squashed and slapped and splattered and demoralized, I decided to just have a very simple locked shot, shallow depth of field, where the king's head just tumbles in and settles nicely. Has a really nice end to really make sure people understand that it was checkmate as well. For those who don't play chess, which is a lot of people. God bless them. So that was the last scene. Going back through, I trimmed some fat. I played with frame rates a little bit. Most of it was shot on ones, 24 frames per second, but I actually ended up using certain scenes at 18 frames per second just so that it lingered a little longer, because I think some of the action ended up being a little faster than I liked, and I decided to bump it down a little bit just so that the audience could really stew on it. And I think it actually ended up leaning also very heavily on sound design. I spent a lot of good time finding the right sounds, and I actually used the sound effects from chess.com of checkmates and checks and moves so that people kind of click in the back of their brain that that's what's happening in the middle of the game. And it all came together, and I'll let you guys watch it one more time. So this was my first time doing a fireside chat where I break down frame by frame what I actually animate and how I actually did it. So I'd love for you guys to tell me what you think about it, because this is an accessible way for me to make YouTube long form content for you guys, and really get into the nitty gritty of my thought process and how I make what I make. So I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I would love to make more of these. I think that I really enjoy sharing the stuff that nobody sees besides me. So if you guys enjoy them as well, then that's a boon. If you want to keep up with the channel, subscribe. I'm also running short form animations like this chess animation on all social media, and I'm hoping to keep doing it. Ooh-ah. Pain. Pain in feet. Numb feet. Feet are numb. Yuck, 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 yuck. Why are my feet so bloodless right now?